determinant of how people vote. That doesn't mean, say, in York County, which has predominantly been a Republican Party, Republican constituency, that there aren't Democrats there. Or likewise, in the city where I live in Baltimore County, it's been predominantly Democrat. That doesn't mean there aren't Republicans there, but space does help, explain the divisions that exist. Race overlaps with this. We see with the graph on, well, my left, that non-whites tend to lean Democratic pretty significantly, while whites tend to lean Republican. If we look at a place, and by here I really maybe say we might use the term class, but I would say kind of one's social status or one's perceived social status. If we use college education as a metric or a measurement for one's status, we see that that is also one of the determining factors in trying to figure out where people are voting. And if these three overlap, if you live in a rural space and if you're white and you're non-college educated, you are very likely to vote Republican, and vice versa. So that we don't have to think of the divisions just over, say, a specific candidate or a specific issue. These tend to be pretty embedded kind of variables in society today. On top of that, particularly since 1980, it's clear that the media has reinforced these divisions. Fox News, I'm not even sure if it existed as a separate news channel in the 1980s. CNN was just getting off the ground, but we see that Republicans and people who lean Republican are getting at least their television news from Fox, say from talk radio. Where those who are heavily Democratic tend to be getting it from CNN down to MSNBC. Some of the old stations, ABC, CBS, NBC, still, you get more of a middle audience. But the point is that we tend to go to the media. We tend to get information from those places that confirm our bias, and that helps drive polarization. If we were to look at ideology or ideas, we can see that the polarization is getting more and more apparent. So in 1994, there still was a good deal of middle ground. The difference between Democrats, your average or median Democratic voter, and your median Republican voter was not that great. That still was the case even in 2004. They were beginning to drift apart a little bit, but by 2014, the difference between your average or median Democratic voter and median Republican voter was getting pretty severe. I don't have a chart that I could show you for 2020, but most likely this gulf has increased, that the parties are getting farther and farther apart. And we can have a whole discussion of why that is the case. If we look at the issues, we see some issues might be surprising, something like gun control or gun policy. There's actually not as much of a difference between Democratic and Republican voters as one would think. Foreign policy, almost no division at all, but over issues dealing with race and ethnicity, over the environment, such as climate change, over healthcare, there are pretty severe ideological differences. So in sum, what I'd say is this election suggests that we are not necessarily a united nation. We are fairly polarized. I'd be glad during the question and answer period to discuss further some of the things that drive this polarization or some thoughts I have on what might reunite us, because I think there are some possible solutions. So with that, I'll turn this over to my colleagues. I'll stop sharing. Sung's turn, I guess.
Sung, you're muted.
Happens to me all the time. All right. So can everyone hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay. And the PowerPoint slides, are they
Good.
seeing properly? Okay, good, great. So hello, everyone. My name is Wook Paik. I'm a political scientist, and I teach political theory and constitutional law here at York College of Pennsylvania. Now, I really wanted my presentation to be a good representation of some of the ideas that I discuss in my classes. And so I'm going to be focusing particularly on how judicial politics seem to inform electoral politics in the United States and vice versa. Now, there are two concepts that I just want to briefly cover before we begin. Um, and these concepts are broadly accepted and widely used by legal scholars, as well as political scientists who study electoral politics. The first is how the American political system really is designed to have overlapping tenures between the different branches of the federal government. And the fact that the federal judiciary, all judges within the federal judiciary have life tenure, tends to make for some very interesting politics because of how sometimes the values that are embedded in the Supreme Court seem to kind of echo for a much longer period in time. But it also, I think, has a feedback effect into the ideological divide that you see in public opinion as well, which is something that I will briefly touch upon. Another concept is how political actors tend to use judicial appointments as a way to as a tool for insurance, right? So basically, they prepare, they hope for the best during the election, but they also prepare for the worst by trying to have more of their own sitting within the federal judiciary. And this serves as a long-term insurance in case they do lose the election. So this is a brief overview of the 2020 election. And Biden was able to flip 5 of the states that Trump took in 2016. Now, you'll notice that I've circled the electoral outcomes in the state of Arizona, Georgia, and Wisconsin. Now, the reason I wanted to focus on these states is because the outcome was very close. It's either around or below 20,000 votes. Now, this isn't surprising in and of itself, but I really want to kind of establish how every really did count in Biden being able to flip these states. Now, in connection to judicial politics, one of the key differences between 2016 and 2020 was how the Republicans were able to really capitalize and advertise the fact that the election was about the election wasn't simply about choosing the next president, but it really was about choosing the next Supreme Court justice. When Justice Scalia passed away in early 2016, some of you may remember how President Obama nominated Merrick Garland, who is currently the candidate for the nominee for the Department of Justice right now under the Biden administration. And what the Senate did, Mitch McConnell, who was at the time the Senate Majority Leader, what he did was to kind of gamble by not having a confirmation hearing, and so this vacancy that continued until the election really was, I think, something that a lot of more establishment Republicans could gravitate towards, because even at the time, I mean, President Trump, well, then candidate Trump, wasn't considered a conventional candidate, and a lot of establishment Republicans had concerns about how or whether he would be a good figure to lead the Republican Party. But the fact that if they won the election in 2016, that the president would be able to nominate the next Supreme Court justice was a real appeal to a lot of these more conventional, traditional, and establishment Republicans. And so while it's hard to isolate the exact effects of this campaign over the next over how the election is really about the next Supreme Court justice, I think the closeness of the election itself and how the electoral outcomes in some of these states are very close really is kind of speaks to how every vote counts. And so the fact that some of the Republicans who weren't very comfortable with candidate Trump during 2016 were able to get on board because of the judicial vacancy in the Supreme Court is, I think, a key factor here in explaining what President Trump had, candidate Trump at the time had going for him in 2016, as opposed to the situation in 2020. Now, I want to have a brief discussion of how judicial politics, how the judicial politics of the Trump presidency might actually have a spillover effect into the Biden presidency. So if you look at the number of judicial appointees for each president during the past few decades, you'll notice that President Trump actually is among the top, has a very significant number, had a very significant number of judicial appointees during his presidency. If you look at the average number of appointees per term, or average number of Supreme Court appointments per term, Trump is really, he leads the pack in terms of the presidents of the past few decades. Now, one thing to consider is how the Supreme Court does seem to be tilting towards the right during the past few decades. And I think this is really, it's not only a reflection of where politics may be heading, but I think it's also, it provides an interesting explanation for polarization, because it's very easy to kind of assume that the American public are moving away, are moving away from each other in terms of like ideology. But if you look at how the center actually is tilting towards the right, that might actually be one way to explain why public opinion has become more polarized, because as the center tilts towards the right, it is more natural for those who lean Democrat to try to retain the middle, whereas whereas Republican voters, they seem to be more motivated by the fact that politics is tilting towards the right, and will continue to try to steer public opinion more to in that direction. So on that note, I am going to turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Beatty. Thank you.
All right, now let me see if I can get my share screen up. All right, I want to make sure my students can attest that. Oh no, I lost the Zoom window. Hold on one second. Oh, there you are. Okay. All right. Okay, I think I'm good to go now. I'm just going to try. I have all your faces over here in my screen and my notes are here, so I'm going to look at nothing. So I'm going to kind of take a different approach. I study American history through a gendered lens. I teach women's history and gender history in addition to early American history. So what I want to talk about today is the kind of gendered lens of the 2020 election campaign and some of the kind of prior campaigns that women ran. So the starting image I have here is, and my dog is here with her squeaker toy, so I apologize. My students will know that she is a regular feature. Hey! So what I have here is an image of 5 of the 6 women that ran for president in the Democratic primary. And I think it was a really kind of remarkable moment for women in politics to have just that many women running for the highest elected office in American history. But these women were not the first to seek the nomination for president. Even Hillary Clinton was not the first. There's kind of a long history of women candidates. But Hillary Clinton's campaign in particular, I think, can teach us a lot about the ways that gender politics work, particularly in presidential elections. So to kind of give an example here, I have a quote from Jen Palmieri, who was Hillary Clinton's communications director, right? And she kind of distills this challenge of having a female candidate, and particularly in the case of Clinton, having been the first female candidate really to enter this sphere, right? So does the campaign ignore or attempt to downplay the fact that the candidate that they're supporting is a woman, and kind of present her as capable of holding elected office and fulfilling the role kind of traditionally codified as masculine, right? This strong, pugnacious, rational leader, right? And at this point, it's the kind of assumption, the normative role is that the president is a man and has always been a man. So do you just kind of neglect the fact that your candidate is a woman and try to paint her in the same light? Or do you lean into the fact that the election of a woman to the highest office in the land would be historic, and that this, the kind of socially constructed traits associated with women of care, empathy, compassion, in other words, a kind of mother figure, is that maybe what the American people are looking for in a president? And should you instead emphasize the candidate's gender, right? So I want to talk about Kamala Harris specifically. Her popularity before joining the Democratic ticket in August, particularly among Democrats, was really predicated on her kind of energy, her prosecutorial record. She became very well known for her questioning of then Judge Kavanaugh, and her strengths as a debater. And she herself notably critiqued Joe Biden himself during the primary for his position on busing earlier in his career. But during the Democratic National Convention, that virtual convention that they held, the country was introduced to a kind of more personal level of Senator Harris. The programming really emphasized a kind of softer image. They focused on her marriage to Doug Emhoff, her being a stepmom to two young adults, right? And they call her Mamala, right? This kind of cutesy name. And her love of cooking, which, you know, I think she's actually quite an accomplished cook and quite good at it. But there is obviously that feminine kind of domestic aspect to cooking, right? And I think it's notable too, to think about the way in which candidates, but particularly women, really have to personalize themselves and make this deep connection with voters, because many Americans, either wittingly or unwittingly, are generally turned off by a woman who's seeking powerful office, right? Often, many people can't exactly explain why they don't like a woman candidate. It's just, you know, something about her that turns them off. Right, so I want to use the example of Hillary Clinton here to kind of illustrate this point. This is a kind of a Gallup poll where Hillary Clinton's popularity is tracked throughout her portion of her public life, right? And you can see the dips basically come at moments where she is running for office, right? So we see her kind of relatively high approval rating in the first couple of years of her being first lady. The numbers start to dip when she's getting involved in President Clinton's healthcare initiatives. They go back up during the impeachment crisis in Clinton's campaign, in Clinton's presidency. They go back down again when she is running for to be a senator in New York State, for New York State. Her numbers kind of steadily increase, are kind of around 50% during her tenure. They dip again when she announces her first presidential run in 2007. They're up in the mid to high 60s when she is serving as Secretary of State for President Obama. They start to go down during the Benghazi controversy and ultimately are at some of their lowest levels when she announces that she will be running for president for the 2016 election, right? So you can really see public opinion on Hillary Clinton shifting and going downward when she is herself seeking high office, right? Kamala Harris is going to, or did face the inherent sexism of these campaigns, but also faces the kind of double bind here of racism, right? And she really faces these challenges from the left and the right. I think it's important to note that it isn't just her opposition that is kind of characterizing her this way, right? Donald Trump would notably kind of target Harris. He thought it would be easier to paint her as a kind of campaign villain, right? She was mean to Brett Kavanaugh. He would say nobody likes her, right? It's kind of this trope of the angry Black woman that is really used in politics and kind of used against Harris, right? You know, she also, like Barack Obama, is going to be briefly subject to a kind of birther conspiracy lie as well, based on her racial identity. Right. On the other side, right, we have one of Biden's top advisors in the campaign, former Senator Chris Dodd. Before Biden had made his decision to select Vice President Harris on his ticket, Senator Chris Dodd was telling donors that he didn't think Kamala Harris was the right pick because she, quote, had no remorse for the way she had treated Biden during the debate, right? That's how debates work. And that she had notably too much ambition, right, to be his vice president, right? I think this word ambition is really important when we're talking about women candidates, right? And a Black woman candidate, no less, right? Of course she has ambition. She's a politician. You have to be ambitious to seek high office, right? It takes ambition to run for president. Biden himself has ambition. Biden himself had ambition when he was in his late 20s, running to be senator to represent Delaware too, but no one kind of lobbed that as an attack at him, right? So there is a kind of far different standard that women are held to in these campaigns, different from men. And this particularly targets women of color in a way that is, again, a kind of intersectional discrimination that they face in these campaigns, right? Now, Kamala Harris was only the second Black woman who had been elected to the United States Senate. Now there are currently 0 serving after her ascendance to the vice presidency. And no Black woman has ever been elected governor of any state. Stacey Abrams in 2018 came very, very close, right? So in this way, Harris's rise and election is a bit of an anomaly. But in the speech she gave the night the election was called in Wilmington, Delaware, she said, quote, "I may be the first woman to hold this office, but I won't be the last." And I would like to maybe end this conversation on a hopeful note that I think she's right. Despite the overwhelming hurdles that women and women of color have in being elected to high office in this country, I think part of what is important in terms of representation and having her in this office now is normalizing for the American public and for children, right? American children, boys and girls, that this is something that is normal and can happen, and that gender will be less of a focus going forward in our elections, hopefully soon, or at least not in this way. Okay. So I will stop my share and hand it back to Sue-Ann.
Much, Dr. Beatty, Dr. Paik, and Dr. Levy. At this time, we will open up the Zoom to any questions. Like I said, you can either use the raise hand feature or put your question right in the chat. Not seeing. Don't be shy, people. We have an expert panel in front of you.
Can I ask Dr. Levy a question?
Absolutely, go right ahead.
You showed the two maps. There was one from Reagan and the one from Obama of all the cities. How closely does the one from the 2020 election look to those two?
So I'll be honest, I was not able to find a map on the county level yet that displayed well. I'll put it that way. My guess is going to be quite similar, So what we may see is if you looked at that map carefully, and it's hard, I think it was probably my fault I didn't blow it totally up. It wasn't simply red, blue. There were also different hues. So I think you're more likely to see a kind of a change of hues. Some of the redder counties probably became even darker red. Is that what we saw? And some of the bluer counties, with a few exceptions, probably became even bluer. And there probably would be, so for example, Dr. Paik noted or circled Arizona and Georgia as two of the states that flipped, that this has been a while. They haven't been Democrat. Well, Georgia hasn't been Democrat since kind of was the solid South back in the 1960s and 70s. You would see certain suburban areas maybe switch, but we had already seen that in a lot of elections, so there's some elections which outlay out that, but I think the geographic divide we're seeing has been getting greater over time. There are some areas, particularly up and down the Mississippi River Valley, all the way up and down the country, where we've seen it go redder, and there's some areas that have gone bluer. The other thing that's notable is just the turnout was much higher on both sides this time. I mean, that was clearly the case. So thank you for your question, Jasmine. Jasmine's one of my star freshman students.
Okay, we have two questions in the chat, and I think Kristen Spangler, you have your hand raised. Go ahead.
Thank you. My question is for Dr. Levy and possibly for Dr. Paik. I'm thinking about J.D. Vance and how when his book was released, there was this big kind of tagline or publicity line about this is the story of why voters voted for Trump. And what I really want to know is, in reading that text and watching the film adaptation of it, and just thinking about all of the related texts that came out around about the same time, why do you think that certain groups of voters who are, let's say, at the bottom of the earning spectrum or at the bottom of their financial resources continuously vote for politicians who don't seem to support aid directed to them?
So Sung, I could take it first and turn it over to you, and Jackie as well. So for those who don't know, J.D. Vance is, and I had a hit a memory cell there, is the author of a book called Hillbilly Elegy. And I, like you, when Trump won the election, I was like everyone else, out in search of explanations for it. So I think Hillbilly Elegy is a good book. But there was a book that came out about the same time that was written by a sociologist who started her research before the election. And then the election just seemed to confirm the findings, and it was called Strangers in Our Land. And she looked at Louisiana, particularly around Lake Charles, an area that has some of the worst environmental record in the country, and really asked the question, why are people in an area that has some of the worst environmental health in the country, why are they voting for Trump? At the same time, she admitted she is a Democrat from Berkeley, UC Berkeley, happened to be my alma mater, and asked kind of economically, why would kind of economic elites have supported what might be perceived as a less economically friendly administration? And she came up with various answers, but I think part of it is the importance of emotion to politics. That doesn't mean we don't have ideas, but there are emotional attachments. We have to look at that. With Louisiana, she broke it down to 4 different groups. There are people, who are just turned off from government, and I think we have to recognize that, so that part of the Trump appeal is this populist appeal that the government can do no right, and it's going to be hard to break people of that belief. Particularly then if you have a government that it really isn't. I think the COVID crisis, ironically, just reinforced that for some people. The government's not doing right. They've lost their faith. She also had people who she called cowboys, who really, they're basically libertarians. They don't want government intervention. They're willing to take chances. They're less concerned about the safety net. And probably if we looked at certain liberal areas and were asked the question, why are people so hardcore with their party? I hate to say it, I think politics is somewhat like religion. Most of us, someone may change religion a little bit. There's not many Americans who really convert, say from Christian to Hinduism. Buddhism, that's how they see it. You might go from Methodist to Lutheran. That's hardly from my perspective, a gigantic switch. So I strongly recommend it. I think it was called Strangers Land. I think the name of the author was Hochschild. So I'll turn this over to Sung, see what else he has to say.
So I'm going to try to hit two birds with one stone by addressing Kristen's question, but in connection to Logan's question about identity politics. So there are different kinds of explanations about the ascendancy of President Trump, and how because if you think about it, it is quite interesting to see how, because one of the appeals that he has constantly made during his campaign was that he's a successful businessman, right? And he's a millionaire, he has lots of money, he's very successful, and yet you do have kind of those who are at the other end of the economic spectrum voting for him. And one way to, again, there are different ways to explain this, though one way to interpret this is through the lens of identity politics. One of the things that I think he's done is to appeal to whiteness as an identity, right? It's very, usually when we think of identity politics, we tend to focus on how it's kind of, this argument about diversity, it's an argument about underrepresented minorities. But if you think about it, there was actually a very interesting survey conducted a few years ago by Pew, and it shows how a significant number of white Americans view this kind of rhetoric as being a reverse discrimination against their identity. And so, so the fact that so I think it's not simply the fact that there seems to be a gap between like the economic basis can partially be explained by the appeal to a certain type of identity politics. And so in that sense, I think while a lot of Republican politicians have accused Democrats of appealing to like identity politics, I think they've kind of embraced their own version of identity politics by crafting this rhetoric about whiteness and how that may be under siege by the rise of this whole argument about diversity.
I was actually going to jump into and maybe piggyback off of this idea of identity politics as it conforms to gender identity, because I think in 2016, a lot of folks were really confused by the number of women that voted for the candidate Donald Trump, knowing, things that he said about women, the Access Hollywood tape that was less than a month before the election, plus the fact that the other option was an actual woman and potentially the first woman president. So where is this gap here between, why are there so many women voting for this particular candidate is the same kind of question that you're asking, Kristen. Why are people, voting it ostensibly against their interests, right? Why are women doing this? Why are the economically marginalized doing this? And in terms of gender, that has a long history, right? White women who are politically active, who are pursuing certain aspects of women's rights in this country, have a history of participating in things like white supremacy, right? The kind of late 19th century suffrage movement after Reconstruction, after Black men are granted the right to vote with the Reconstruction amendments, although there were obviously Jim Crow measures that prohibited that, white women suffragists switched tactics and started leaning into white supremacist rhetoric to argue for the need for white women's right to vote, right? And you know, there you can go back even farther to women enslavers who identified more with their racial and economic privilege than they did with their gendered subjugation, right? So if there's an opportunity to cling to a certain particular privilege or identity, women have taken it in the past. I should say white women have taken it in the past, and there's a history of that, right? So the breakdown that Dr. Levy kind of presented in determining kind of party or ideological affiliation, I think makes sense. The kind of region where you're from, your class to a certain extent, and your race, and that gender is not really a determinative or a primarily determinative figure in how people vote necessarily, right? I think more women vote Democratic, but not overwhelmingly so. And there's obviously a strong base of women in the Republican Party as well.
Okay. Logan, I think that was very similar to your question. So I'm hoping that that answered your question. Maybe you can give me a thumbs up. So moving on, the next question is, how do you think that the numerous presidential norms that Trump either broke or disregarded will be handled by politicians in DC from now on?
So I'm going to jump in since I do study constitutional law. So the thing about and I've thought about this question a lot because former President Trump was certainly a very unconventional president, and in many ways he has really kind of distanced himself from the normal path that a lot of presidents have taken. Now, at the same time, though, I also wonder how his presidency might actually speak to the resilience of some of these norms, because, I mean, one of the things that I found very interesting is how his rhetoric is usually much more extreme and much more stronger than the actual measures taken. And whenever he's sought to kind of realize policies in a way that serves in a way that really acknowledges his and realizes his rhetoric, there always has been pushback. I mean, there's been pushback from the courts at various levels. I mean, the travel ban comes to mind. The travel ban that President Trump implemented actually is, I believe, the third iteration. There were two previous versions that were struck down by federal courts. And so in many ways, I think, despite his rhetoric, it really does seem to be that the political system really was functioning in a way that mitigated the actual effect of what he was trying to do. I don't know if that speaks directly to your question here. I mean, I don't know how satisfied you are with that response, but just in terms of changes in constitutional norms, I would definitely say that the norms turned out to be much more resilient than many people believed.
I was going to say too, I think it really depends on what happens next. I think Trump's norm breaking, as you've phrased it, demonstrates the kind of holes in our Constitution and things that are not explicitly written into law that have just been accepted, where other politicians have been willing to be or have been able to be shamed by the public for breaking these norms, or whose colleagues would hold them accountable for various norm breaking, right? I'm thinking of Richard Nixon, right? Where his Republican Party ended up turning against him and saying it's time to resign. Right, we don't have that moment in Trump's presidency, where what we have instead is a kind of solidification of support in his own party. So I think it depends, and a lot of government elected officials now are at least thinking about limitations on executive power and a way to codify things that have been accepted as norms that were broken, right, with no real legal consequences, right? Something like the tax returns, right? Are they going to codify something like that because that's a kind of information that voters might want? Or the kind of independence of the Justice Department is something that people expect, but was not necessarily the case during the Trump administration. So I think it really depends on what the public demands and what officials end up codifying into law in the coming weeks, months, years, however long it takes for them to decide what they'd like to do going forward.
And just because I'll add my 2 cents, not that it helps or not. I mean, I think I'm kind of in agreement with Sung here that if you look at the election of Biden, it suggests there was a yearning to kind of return to norm. I mean, he is about as normal of a politician as we've had for a long time. I mean, he's not particularly charismatic. He's more of a grandfatherly character. So there are at least some people who I think wanted kind of this normative person that won't upset the apple cart. On the other hand, I think the polarization in the country will continue to drive for kind of, was it, I don't know if the word is anormative behavior or disnormative behavior. And you see this particularly, I think, even more so because the question had to do with in DC, within the House, where people are more concerned about winning their district, and districts are quite polarized. We used to go to the center, and we're seeing a decreasing tendency to go to the center, that those people who make the most noise get the most attention. And unfortunately, I think social media has just exacerbated that, and the nature of media has exacerbated that. If you're kind of a boring person, you don't really get that much attention, particularly in the House. I mean, you think about probably the two best known Congress people right now are Marjorie Taylor Greene and Alexander Octavio Cortez. They're both freshman congressmen. Usually have to be around like 40 years before anyone knows who you were. Unfortunately, maybe we need to restore the norm where seniority matters. I'm not sure if I agree with that. I don't think that's true. But in the old days where seniority mattered, then those people wouldn't be getting much attention. They wouldn't have much power.
Okay. Our next question from Colin is, in your opinion, how have extremist and populist conspiracy theories played a role in the election results?
So one of the things that I mentioned in my very brief presentation is, I mean, it's very hard to isolate causes for why people voted a certain way. I mean, usually it's a combination of different factors. I mean, clearly there was COVID-19. Another factor that I argued that Trump didn't have going for him was the fact that there wasn't a major judicial vacancy where more traditional establishment Republicans felt comfortable voting for him. But so to talk about, like, it's hard to really ascertain the effects of these conspiracy theories in American politics. Now, one of the key arguments that are made about public opinion, though, is that usually it's very easy for us to conflate the intensity of one's political preferences with actual numerical majorities. So the stronger one's political opinion is, the louder their voice is in the public sphere, it almost seems as though that has kind of grown into a numerical majority. It's very easy for us to kind of have that illusion. Now, again, I may be wrong here. I mean, hopefully that these conspiracy theories are, hopefully I'm correct that these are actually just a reflection of a very small subsection of those who voted Republican, but I mean, that's to be seen. Again, I can't say conclusively what the actual impact was or what it will be. Though I do believe that it's that the way in which their voice has been so loud is part of the reason why it almost seems like they have taken over the party, when in fact I think that's not entirely true.
I think one of the biggest consequences of these conspiracy theories, at least being central to the media narrative around the kind of among conspiracy theorists rejection of the election results, the real challenge is that a lot of Americans have lost confidence in the democratic, small d democratic process, right? If you think that, and there were obviously Clinton voters in 2016 that thought there were obvious disadvantages to their candidate, the kind of level of Russian interference on social media and the Electoral College, right? There are Trump voters in 2020 who feel like there was kind of unsubstantiated, but fraud in these elections. That when people lose confidence in the electoral process, they don't vote, they become absent, they become disengaged. And that's really dangerous to the survival of small d democracy in the long run. When you lose the people, when you lose that attention to popular sovereignty, it's a really big and I think systemic problem that we are going to have to deal with in kind of restoring confidence in our institutions. And I think Dr. Levy talked about this as well. That there are certain elements that want to denigrate the role of government in people's lives. And when the government fails, when our institutions fail, that seems to confirm that bias, right? That government is bad, that the people that we elect don't serve us, and that my vote doesn't really matter, right? Those are really dangerous ideas in a democracy. So it's going to be very hard work to restore confidence, particularly for those people whose chosen candidate did not win, right? When they have that kind of confirmation bias that there must be something wrong because all I see is my political identity, and how is this not reflected? There must be some kind of fraud or problem with the system, and that's incredibly dangerous in the long run.
Okay. We do have one more question. I think we have time for this one last question. Let me go ahead. How do you believe that the environmental factors of Middle America, such as poor education, lack of economic and social mobility, opportunities, etc., as well as the use of internet as a social escape mechanism by those same citizens, has led to the radicalization and polarization of the average middle American? It's a long one. Dr. Levy, yeah, there we go.
I mean, I think it's a great question. I think it's a really complicated question. So I think the first part of the question, suggests a declining status for a lot of, particularly kind of say, white working class Americans, kind of the type that Kristen was talking about in her first question, and the hillbilly elegy. And I don't think there's any difficulty really in part explaining Trump's original appeal by suggesting that there are people, if they didn't feel disenfranchised, they felt that somehow there was a long-term trend of a government not really solving their problems. I don't know if it's so much kind of an environmental problem as it's kind of a structural economic problem that we've had. I mean, we have seen pretty much stagnating wages across the country for the last 40 years. And this COVID crisis in some ways has only made it worse insofar as people who are on the top are being able to survive it a lot better than people who've been living paycheck to paycheck. That said, I always have a problem when we use that term middle America, and we're really using it almost interchangeable with middle white America. So that we have blacks who are working class and Hispanics who are working class and live in urban areas, and they have come to different political conclusions of what the solution is. It's kind of like when Jackie talked about women voting. If I take out non-white women, probably the majority of white women voted for Trump, but women, if we add black and Hispanic women in and Asian women in, we get a different equation. In terms of the social escape, I'm not sure if I can address that. I'm not sure. I understand that there's maybe a lot of these citizens are socially escaping. Um, but I'll give Trump credit, that Trump engaged people politically more than other candidates did. I mean, if you go back 4 years ago and realize that going into the GOP primary, George Bush's brother was kind of the elite pick to be the nominee, and he just didn't engage people. And he was like a lead balloon that just. I feel sorry for him sometime. His timing was really wrong. I actually think he would have been a better president than his brother. I think he probably was more talented. He was more, but that's just how it works. I mean, his brother came along in 2000, and then 8 years, 16 years later, people who had voted for George Bush were more disengaged, and whether they're escaping. I have trouble as a historian. I think there's always been escapism, but I always think of the people like on the prairie. You know, they just escaped into what? The lights went out at 5 o'clock at night in a sod house. I guess you had no alternatives, but they weren't particularly actively engaged in politics after 5 o'clock at night. So maybe that's kind of flippant. But anyway, I think your first part of the question is really good. I think we have to think about the way kind of not just poor education, a lack of good education, a lack of economic opportunities has influenced people.
I think the social media aspect is more of people seeking community and kind of self-affirmation of their chosen identity groups, right? We talked about identity politics, and Dr. Levy in his talk talked about the ways in which we consume media with which we already are predisposed to agree, right? Social media is basically that, but much more accessible and participatory, right? Your feeds are curated based on people who you agree with, people whose values you think reflect your own, right? I think there's been a lot written about the role of Facebook, both in 2016 and 2020, and the way that their algorithms, and I think YouTube does this to a certain extent as well, but the ways in which their algorithms drive people into more niche and often more extremist views, particularly with this new and very violent QAnon conspiracy theory, right? That people were kind of directed to that group from previously anti-vaxxer groups, but even before that, these groups of kind of middle-class suburban moms trying to talk about essential oils, right? Eventually, Facebook recommends these groups because they might have the same interests, but it becomes further kind of pigeonholed. But at the same time, I think particularly during a year where we've all been stuck indoors and doing things on Zoom that would normally be in person, we are seeking real human connection. And when you find a community that affirms who you are and where you can have those more meaningful, or you kind of feel more meaningful conversations, people seek that out, and people kind of bury themselves in it sometimes too, when that's their only access to a kind of real human connection. So I think it's more about community and confirmation bias when we're talking about social media, right? Rather than maybe necessarily some kind of specific underlying social problem or social identity.
Dr. Paik, any last comments on that question?
Oh, so if I can just add 2 brief remarks to that. There's actually an excellent book by SERI Turkle titled Alone Together, and it talks about how technology, the title itself, I think, it shows how like we are, how as Dr. Beatty mentioned, how we seem to we ironically gravitate more towards these online virtual spaces to our phones. Like we dig ourselves in our phones in order to try to seek out community. And I think she does a good job kind of portraying the way in which it works psychologically. So if that's something that interests you, I would definitely recommend SERI Turkle's book. Another kind of plug-in is how while he wasn't able to join us today, we do have a colleague within the department who actually focuses on the effects of social media on political behavior and political psychology. His name is Nick Anspach. If that's something that interests you, this is certainly something that that his research focuses on. So just to kind of plug in one of my colleagues and kind of advertise the department here. So again, if that's something that interests you, we definitely talk about that here in the department, and there's an expert here with us.
Great. Thank you so much. And I'm just going to share my screen really quickly. As I said, give you the screen of the upcoming Spartan Speak series that are coming up. The next one's coming up. Would like to thank very much Dr. Levy, Dr. Paik, and Dr. Beatty. I think this last hour has been very informative and very enlightening. And again, we thank you so much for creating this presentation. So that is it for the evening. Again, we hope that you will sign up for any of our future Spartan Speaks presentations that we have. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a good night.
Thank you. Thank you for coming, guys.
Thanks,
See you,
everyone.
Mike. Jasmine, bye-bye.